Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press, we'll be talking about podcasts, academic podcasts more specifically. Podcasts have been around for a while now, but they're still an emerging media in an academic context, both in terms of a disciplinary media studies approach and as a recognized scholarly communication format. Joining me on the program for the next 4 episodes are Laurie Beckstead, Associate Professor of Sound Media in the RTA School of Media at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, Canada, and Dario Linares, a writer, podcaster, and independent researcher. Laurie and Dario are editors of an upcoming book due in February from Wilfrid Laurier University Press called Podcast Studies, Practice into Theory. In it, they critically examine podcasting as a scholarly communication format and its use in pedagogy and research. In this third episode of our series, we examine academic podcasting in practice as a pedagogical tool, a conduit to an academic adjacent audience, and as an important pathway to inclusive scholarship. All right, so let's get into sort of academic podcasting in action. So part 3 of your book outlines podcasting as a pedagogical practice. So I'm curious if you both could talk a little bit about how academics are using podcasts in the classroom. Are these assignments based in production skills, or using podcasts as sources for research, or both?
Yeah, I can start this one.
Sure.
It's definitely both of those things. And as I mentioned before, it was really interesting how podcasting was taken up just about immediately after it was invented by teachers and professors in the classroom.
Mhm.
And so there's a researcher by the name of Oliver Magar in 2009, I think, he identified 3 ways that podcasting was being used in higher education, and he called them substitutional, supplementary, and creative. And so substitutional means you can use a podcast as a substitute for a traditional lecture.
Mhm.
And for example, one of our authors in the book, Kelly Bowling, she describes in her chapter how during COVID-19, she needed to change her course to go online, and she decided to create podcasts as in place of what would normally be an in-person lecture. And it was quite successful thing, but it wasn't just here's the podcast, listen to it, like just
Mhm.
shut up and listen. She built a whole framework of student participation and feedback around each episode that
Right.
happened. And so again, there's that discursiveness over the course of time and over episodes. So yeah, that's the substitutional. And then there's supplementary, and a lot of people are using it in this way. And that's where you bring in podcasts as supplementary material to the core lecture. Um, and so, say, like, for example, if you bring in an episode from the Warrior Life podcast, which is a podcast about Indigenous issues and studies, you could use it to help illuminate, say, issues around Indigenous child welfare reform, or whatever your class is about, right? So you can go
Mhm.
and find supplementary materials. And I think that the conversational nature of the podcast make the content more accessible to many students who grapple with dense texts, right? Like that might be difficult for them, but being able to hear somebody converse about it, which, this is maybe going off on a tangent, but maybe that's why Notebook LM, the new Google tool that
Oh.
allows you to kind of give it some papers and it spits out a conversational podcast. Be still my beating terrified heart. But that's a whole other thing, right?
Yeah, I wrestled
Um,
with bringing that up in this discussion, but you've already done that, so
Yeah, sorry,
yeah,
and I don't even know if I'm ready to even talk about it,
I
right? So
know.
it's
Yeah.
just, yeah, it's that's pretty brand new. But so getting back to those 3 things, so we've got the substitutional, the supplementary, and then there's the creative aspect or the creative use of in pedagogy of podcasts, and that's where you get the students to actually produce a podcast. And so it could be where you're not really emphasizing the craft of podcasting. Maybe it's just you want students to, make a podcast about something in your history class instead of writing an essay.
Hmm.
And in that case, you're not too worried about the sound quality and the technical issues, but, it's another way for students to demonstrate that they've met the learning outcomes outside of the hegemonic written word that we tend to rely on so much in the classroom. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
that could be also a way to sort of uh, decolonize the classroom, so to speak, and kind of present assignments that kind of meet students where they're at. Maybe, like you said, the written word might not be something a student excels at, but explaining it verbally via podcast might be, much more comfortable for them.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah,
100% an accessibility thing,
yeah.
to allow students to choose the medium through which they express how they've mastered the learning outcomes.
Hmm.
How much that's the pinnacle of making things accessible for your students.
Right. Um, so the applications of academic podcasts extend beyond, the academy to bring scholarly information to the public. And we've talked about this a little bit, but why is podcasting such an effective tool to reach non-academic audiences?
Yeah, I think it is related to some of the stuff we've already discussed, but I think that kind of interrelationship between the form and the content is
Hmm.
key. So oral mediation has to imbue some kind of emotionality for for it to be listenable.
Yeah.
And I think, it always reminds me of going to academic conferences, which over the years I've come to loathe, where most of the time you're just watching somebody with their head down reading their paper.
Yep.
Um, and I think that there is that sense of the loss of the art of presenting, or the loss of the art of being able to speak in a way that lends a sort of, it could be emotionality, it could be passion, it could be stridency, it could be anything, right? And that then invites the listener to feel like that there is something at stake here. So that's the sort of the form in terms of the way in which you can articulate the ideas of what it is that you're wanting to try and get across, right?
Hmm.
And then there's the content element, where that has to be shaped then so it can be spoken. So, like, obviously one of the key things I think in research, whether it's, I mean, mostly in STEM subjects, but also in arts and humanities, is the idea of data or statistics, or how do you do that on a podcast? You have to
Right.
find a way in which a story has to be told around what these figures actually mean,
Hmm.
because otherwise it's just going to get completely lost. I mean, when you're writing something down on a table, on a, in a journal article, that's fine. You can look at the figures and then read, but it doesn't work on a podcast. So it's interesting. I think that the way that podcasts are set up have to automatically lend themselves to being made accessible in that sort of form and content thing. And then, of course, there's the sort of there's the open source distribution.
Mm.
I mean,
Right.
paywalls haven't generally worked at all with podcasting, because I think people just got so used to the idea of them being free. And even in academia, where there's so many small podcasts, even the smallest of the small podcasts is probably going to get a bigger audience than 99% of written journal articles.
Hmm.
So, it's more difficult now, because as podcasting has been brought somewhat back into the traditional structures of broadcasting, it's more and more difficult to see new podcasts than it was, say, in between 2015 and 2018, I would say.
Yep.
Um, so that's probably more. It's probably more difficult now to get your podcast out into, or in front of, or into the ears of new people than it is to actually make the thing.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's the difficulty. Whether sort of brand new academic podcasts are cutting through to audiences outside academia, that's probably an area that needs quite a bit of research.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Derry, you mentioned sort of that the need for that emotional connection. Has anybody looked at, like, the differences in on what a person might choose in terms of it's like a narrative style podcast versus, a strictly interview based or nonfiction kind of format that might be more similar to radio, and how those kind of connect with audiences in certain ways, and you know which of those or both maybe work in a more academic context.
Yeah, I think that there's quite a bit of that in Martin Baker, is it? His book with Lance Dan on podcasting, which came out about the same time
Martin
as
Spinelli.
Martin Spinelli. Sorry, I was mixing up my Martins. Martin Spinelli, yeah. And they interviewed a lot of the producers of quite high end podcasts that were, a lot of them are still around today, but the big ones from back in sort of 2018. And what was interesting about that was that a lot of the research that they did came from interviews with the producers who had anecdotal evidence about what their audiences were thinking and why they were choosing certain things. And Korfmacher's book, which I previously mentioned, that's interesting because it does break down the different genres of fan podcasts and why audiences choose one particular genre of fan podcasts over another. Alan Erowitz's book on intimacy is interesting as well, because I think that delves into certain decisions with regards to the again, that sort of oral form and what appeals to different audiences in that context. But like many areas of podcast studies, I think it's an area that needs more work in terms of why certain choices are made over others. And I think that's a difficult thing to research, isn't it? Because a lot of it is intuitive, a lot of it is serendipitous. A lot of it is to do with kind of an individual's outside psychological or social influences, maybe.
Sure.
And a lot of it is to do with whether the producer has a grant to be able to pay a team of. So some of these forms are really expensive to produce. So narrative nonfiction, for example, this is really intensive style of podcasting to produce, where there's, researchers and lots of interviewees and lots of editing and lots of story crafting. And so there's whole teams brought together for that. So I think the interview style podcast, where there's dialogue about research, I think that's the one that appeals most to scholars, simply because it's pretty accessible. It's pretty simple to produce. There's not a lot of cost associated with it. But flipping that to what audiences want, right? I think those narrative nonfiction style podcasts are fantastic. They really suck you in with a story. But I think we can give people credit that a good conversation is also just as appealing to people. So
absolutely. And speaking sort of about the accessibility of it, as we've mentioned earlier, that podcasting is definitely a positive aspect of it is that it is accessible. Minimal equipment, anybody can record an episode and put it up online. But how does that accessibility then translate into a more fluid and inclusive form of scholarship? What are, in that sense, what might be some of the barriers to entry for podcasting that still need to be addressed?
Right. Yeah, I mean, people like to say that anyone, quote unquote, anyone can podcast. And I think that's mostly true, at least if you're thinking of it within, the context of having the potential to publish something that can reach an audience. So, obviously traditional media, legacy media, they're very gate kept, but podcasting is not gate kept in that way. Like if you decide you want to do it, you can. If you have access to the internet, a microphone, and some recording and editing platform or software, you can. And so for many people, those very things can be the barrier, right? So we don't want to just kind of blithely say, oh, it's available to anyone, because it's still, even those barriers dictate whose voices are heard, who can podcast, who can participate. So but I mean, because it's mostly accessible, it means that podcasting allows for voices to be heard that have been traditionally underrepresented, or even just completely kept out of academic spaces. So that can only be a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I think as long as the gatekeeping doesn't, I mean, I think if scholarly podcasting becomes systematized within academia or by the university or by whatever institutions, we do risk possibly losing that openness.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the other things that makes podcasting accessible is its immediacy. So you can write something and well, Dario and I know of this particular book. When did we start it, Dario? I think we talked to we started it in 2020. And
Mm.
so it's going to be published in early 2025. So I mean, talk about not immediate at all, right? So
Right.
but you can record a podcast to talk to someone about like something they just thought of or something they just discovered or some research they just carried out, and it can get to audiences virtually immediately, which is much better than the publishing timelines and even timelines for conferences and that sort of thing. And I think you mentioned this, Bill, that the knowledge that there's a potential much wider audience
Mm-hmm.
there. Anyone with access to the internet and a playback device can listen to a podcast. So automatically that makes it potentially more available, more accessible to a much wider audience. And I think also that makes um, I may have mentioned this, but I think just having that potentially wider audience leads the scholar to try to be more accountable to that audience, to those communities who are involved in the research or affected by the research.
Yep.
So yeah, I think there's multiple ways in which it can make scholarship much more accessible.
You just heard from Lori Beckstead, Associate Professor of Sound Media in the RTA School of Media at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, Canada, and Dario Linares, a writer, podcaster, and independent researcher. Join us next week when we look at podcasting's academic future, from its ability to center marginalized voices, how podcasting fits in with disciplines other than media studies, and how librarians can add podcasts to their resource recommendations. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.